Well, I'm encouraged by your optimism, though it's a certain kind of optimism, I suppose, that says the crisis is so acute that reality can't be denied. I mean, that's part of what I'm hearing as your optimism.
Let's break that up for just a moment. I mean, I think one can argue, I have certainly been arguing for 4 years, that the crisis in democracy and the crisis in public health relative to the way children were being manipulated and harmed by the addictive properties of social media platforms, the ability of bullies to harm other kids, that those things were already at crisis level. And what we were having was a struggle to get people to attribute the responsibility. I would argue, and you and I have talked about this, it's in the book, that internet platforms are really important to our economy. The internet and technology in general are super important. And the country has faced this kind of challenge before. In 1960, we finally realized that the chemicals industry, which in the 50s was really the internet of that economy. Remember, I mean, if you go watch The Graduate, even in 65, they're talking plastics, right? I mean, the reason that industry was so profitable and so rapid growing was they could pour their waste products anywhere. They would dump toxic chemicals into the atmosphere. They would pour mercury into fresh water and not bear any of the cost or any of the consequences. So the country bore the cost of public health crisis and environmental damage. In 1960, we start to pass the legislation that shifts the incentives and shifted accountability. We did the same thing in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act, because people before that were making drugs and promising the moon, right? Everything was hydroxychloroquine, right? They would say this is a miracle cure, even though it might kill you. It might have actual mercury in it, or it would have, heroin or cocaine in it. And we said you got to establish safety and efficacy before you can put a drug out. And the building trades in the 1880s, after the big fires, we put accountability to the people who built houses. We said, look, you got to build them to a certain standard. And if you fail, you're accountable. Now, we need to do this with tech companies. We can't have tech companies just shipping products when they think they're done. I mean, look at what's going on in facial recognition. The implicit bias in those systems, particularly in law enforcement, was having a massive harmful effect on people of color. And in employment situations, not just people of color, but also on women. AI as a concept, as applied to facial recognition, as applied to things like employment, as applied to housing. In those areas, the data sets used to train the artificial intelligence were based on things full of bias. And so that bias was carried over, but buried inside a black box that was inscrutable. And there's no accountability, no responsibility. And I think we have to shift that. And what I love about the crisis we're facing now is that the connection between the business model of internet platforms and the politicization of public health could not be more clear. It is unambiguous. And as a consequence, if we get a different administration, and that different administration is trying to be responsive to the legitimate civil rights issues being raised by these protests, to the legitimate issues about how we run our healthcare system, given how frail it has been in a pandemic, given the really obvious flaws in our economy, where we've outsourced a gazillion jobs and created a supply chain so fragile that a small disruption from public health completely paralyzed it. When we're going to look for, well, what do we do instead? The one thing we shouldn't do is let the tech guys lead us out of this.
Now, in terms of the leverage to start achieving some of those things, I mean, one fear on the other side is that this crisis is just accelerating the digitalization of everything, and it further empowering the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netscape, Google. These companies are only getting aggrandizing power. I mean, Amazon, just one obvious example. So given the relationship between that kind of economic power and political leverage, does that mean we folks have to work twice as hard? I mean, what is the ultimate net, the balance here?
Well, before the murder of George Floyd, all the signs were that the big tech companies were going to emerge from the pandemic much stronger than they went in, right? Far stronger. And that efforts like contact tracing were being used as an excuse for them to extend their surveillance into places that previously didn't exist, with technologies that can't possibly work for contact tracing, but work great for gathering data. And, you know, I was so depressed. I mean, we didn't happen to talk that week. But when George Floyd was murdered, it triggered a popular revolt, a peaceful popular revolt that is questioning the things that I have been questioning, you know, not just in my book, but in my daily activities about, are we, you know, is the country following a good direction? And the COVID pandemic exposed the flaws in the economic model we were using, the version of capitalism we had where all the benefits went to a tiny percent of the population. That clearly broke completely when the supply chains broke. Our healthcare system, right? Employer-based healthcare stops working when unemployment's at 20 or 30%. And then you have the policing thing. And the policing thing was so clear. And the notion that DuVernay's film Selma, you know, came out in front of this thing and everybody was able to watch it right after the protests began, and you got to see the accidental but very successful implementation of the principles of Martin Luther King to the same problem he applied it to just 50 years later. And you're seeing changes in attitudes that are so profound that it seems to me we shouldn't exclude the possibility that among the many things that get rethought will be our approach to capitalism, our approach to technology, our approach to healthcare, all of which I think we can safely say have contributed to making the problems we're dealing with now worse.
So, Roger, you've been meeting with all sorts of allies and potential allies and made some good friends, and there have been some strange bedfellows, I know. I'd be curious what you've learned. I mean, maybe it's what let's just assume is the case in terms of political actors and their leverage points, but do you have any sort of surprises you can share with us as your Mr. Smith Goes to Washington adventures here?
So the piece that I really didn't understand before, Scott, was that our system was designed to prevent rapid change. It was designed to essentially be conservative and protect the status quo and to create lots of hurdles for change to make sure the country was actually embracing change before it could happen. So our system has lots of veto points in it. And over the last 50 years, we've added dozens more veto points. So there's one path to success and maybe 100 ways to veto it. And that created a paralysis. And, you know, the topping point was this notion that the use of the filibuster to require 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything, which is clearly not something the framers intended. So we're at this point of paralysis, and I didn't understand that going in. I did not have high expectations for getting anything passed because there was almost no awareness of the problem when I began. So my expectations were not that we were going to get laws passed, but seeing where all the veto points are and watching Google and Facebook in particular exploit them, they are so good at it. I mean, I'll give you an example. If you look in academia at the people who do research on internet platforms, I'm going to guess that 95% or more are funded either directly or indirectly by Google and Facebook, and they know it, which means that those research projects are constrained in ways where the outcome generally results in something that's favorable to the internet platforms. I was previewing a book for somebody recently who is one of the foremost researchers on how disinformation spreads. And, that program's completely dependent on the large platforms for data. And so, surprise, 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 if you read this thing closely, you can, his conclusions are not what the data says, but his conclusions are what the money says. And that's how our system works. And I've gotten super comfortable with that. I have great respect for this guy because his research is really interesting and he's done really good stuff. And back to your Upton Sinclair thing, I understand the economics of how our country works. But those barriers are what we're up against. And that is why the combination of a pandemic and George Floyd are essential, because with anything less than that, there's just no way. And, Vice President Biden is not the kind of guy who is a student of technology or an activist by nature. And so for him to come out and be critical of Facebook, that tells me that something has changed here. And, I'm not breaking out bottles of champagne because nothing substantive has happened yet. But here's the part people miss. We do not need a global solution to these problems. In fact, I have advocated to state attorneys general, to mayors, to governors, to people in Europe, that we want a different solution in every single country and every single state and every single city. We want everybody to grab the piece of privacy they care about and create some insane thing or to optimize for that. And the reason is because these platforms are global. They want to automate everything. And if you have conflicting things in 10 different jurisdictions, that's going to drive them nuts.
I don't know that a lot of people really understand how the extent to which the pace of new business creation in tech in Silicon Valley has slowed as a result of these monopolies. Can you talk a little bit about their dead hand and what the ultimate systemic effect of that is?
So basically, the effect of these companies on the market shows up in two different ways. The most successful strategy for somebody who is interested in creating a social platform or some new gee-whiz AI technology is to create a business that you sell to Google, Facebook, or Amazon. And so you typically sell it very small for what is, in the larger context, a small amount of money. And then they take the parts of it that they like and they get rid of all the things that they don't like. That has been the driver of venture activity for a long time. And then you see people going way far afield, Uber, Airbnb, WeWork, and taking, if you will, the culture of Silicon Valley and applying it in a category that Facebook and Google and Amazon are not going to go into. That's where most of the unicorns came from. And most of those things are, really bad ideas that only worked because the capital markets had too much cash and the perceived risk of throwing $100 million or $1 billion at some startup run by a 24-year-old. That perceived risk was very low, and so people did it like crazy. What you really haven't seen, let me give you a super simple example. Everybody here, when you go into a subscription for the Wall Street Journal or whatever, runs into a Google product called CAPTCHA that says, "Are you a robot?" And you have to check off a box that says, "I am not a robot." And then they show you a bunch of pictures. And they're always things related to driving. So click on all the pictures that have a bicycle, or all the pictures that have a car, or all the pictures that have a stoplight or a stop sign. And they tell you that you're checking that off in order for them to determine you're a human. That's not what they're doing at all. They figure out you're a human based on your mouse movement, how your hand moves. They just need the photographs to train the artificial intelligence for their self-driving cars. Now, here's the thing. Let's think about what Google would do with the data about your hand movement. They keep everything, so I assume they have a history of all of us based on every time we've done CAPTCHA. So if one day I were to develop Parkinson's disease or some other neurological disorder, where would it show up first? Would it be observable? Or would it show up in my hand and mouse movement? Obviously, it's going to show up in the hand and mouse movement first. But here's the problem. In Google's business model, their customer for a piece of information like that is somebody who wants to buy certainty. And in our healthcare system, that's number one will be your health insurance company. Why? Because what they want to do is either raise your insurance rates or deny you coverage before a diagnosis is made. And it becomes a pre-existing condition that they cannot get rid of you for. Now, you sit there and go, well, hang on. Why wouldn't they create an insurance product that basically sat there and said, look, if you show any symptoms of a neurological disorder, we're going to alert you first thing. We're going to protect your privacy. We're going to give you a list of neurologists to go see. And you're going to pay us, depending on how old you are, increasing amounts of money to make sure that we capture this early before, it does any serious harm. Well, that model, that's not Google's model. There's no way they're doing that. And that thing can't come to market because Google's blocking the space. And Amazon's blocking the space. Amazon did a deal with the National Health Service in the UK to get tens of millions of people's personal health data, right? We have a law in the United States called HIPAA that in theory maintains privacy of our data. The problem is it doesn't cover prescriptions. It doesn't cover tests. Well, if you know everybody's prescriptions and their tests, you know what diseases they have. And that stuff is not being used to make your health better. It's being used for the benefit of insurance companies and drug companies. And I'm sitting there going, there's something really wrong with that, okay? And if you think about the present moment, the moment where millions of people are going into the street to peacefully demonstrate about police brutality, man, if we just said, hey, yo, while we're at it, we could change the healthcare system away from the ridiculous incentives we have today, right? And create an opportunity for alternative models of technology to come to market, that would be a really cool thing. And there are literally millions of examples like that. That one's so crystal clear, though.
Yeah. So that's such a great example that I'd just love to just pause on it a bit, because I think a lot of people would say, okay, well, now wait a minute. Surely there are laws that would prevent your insurer from, and surely people will say there is meaningful good that can come from harvesting data to predict things. If we can somehow build that firewall, if we can somehow build a moat to keep the more baleful uses at bay.
Right.
And so I guess the question is obviously, I mean, do you have faith that sort of the bomber always gets through? That are you pessimistic that it's possible to keep?
No, the problem we have today is the economic incentives for doing harm are greater than the economic incentives for doing good. That the way the system works today, the protection of the rackets that exist with the monopolies in pharmaceuticals, with the oligopoly in healthcare insurance, and the incentives to deny coverage are so great. And the way the law works, it's so straightforward. As long as no diagnosis has been made, you can exclude somebody. And obviously, capture doesn't qualify as a medical diagnosis as currently constructed. And so we have to change the incentives. This is why I want to treat these guys the way we treated chemicals companies or the way we treated drug companies back in 1906, which is saying, look, you're really important, but we're not going to allow you to operate, without supervision because your judgment is terrible. And when given a choice, what is the next thing you do? In Google's case, it's a smart cities project in Toronto where they were literally going to replace self-determination, free will, if you will, and democracy with algorithms. Now, the city of Toronto, thanks to a group of activists, shut that down. So that was good news. But what was Facebook's strategy? They were going to invent a cryptocurrency called Libra that was designed to replace the pound and the dollar and the yen and the euro. And, that was a direct challenge to the sovereignty of nations because nations only control two things, right? The legitimate use of force, military and police, and currency. So you take out one of those two things, and And the thing is, Facebook has the scale that it was really easy to imagine them doing enormous harm and us allowing rich people to essentially move all of their money in a way that would not allow it to be taxed or controlled. And you might say to yourself, well, I like that. Or you might say, I really like smart cities. I really think it would be better to optimize cities for efficiency, even if that means everybody has to eat the same breakfast. And my point is, that's fine if we have a debate first and we have a real conversation. Everybody's up to speed and they know what we're making this decision about. When Toronto got that chance, they voted no. I mean, they didn't actually get to vote no, but they raised a big enough stink that Alphabet, the parent company of Google and Sidewalk Labs, withdrew the project.
We've been at the, maybe finally perhaps, we've been at the activist level, we've been at the policy level. Can you talk a bit about how people in their own lives can be more mindful of surveillance capitalism and being manipulated and just choices, reasonable choices that people have within their reach to maybe change their lives a bit?
So when I wrote the first draft and we published the hardcover edition of Zucked, I was persisting in the belief that each one of us had a role to play in our own behavior. I muted it in the hardcover from what the original viewpoint that I had was. And I abandoned it entirely in the revision of the paperback because what's going on here is so manipulative. It is being imposed upon us. And it's being imposed throughout the economy in a way that a lot of people participate in. And as a consequence, I think the most important thing to do is to be informed about what the consequences are of the business model of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Twitter. And what that really means is I don't want people to feel guilty because they like Facebook or feel guilty for liking Instagram or liking YouTube. But they do need to understand that if there is a video about a public health matter or a political matter on YouTube that is not sourced from one of the top 2 or 3 news organizations in the country, it is almost certainly disinformation. 90+% of what's on there is disinformation. Almost everything they're recommending is disinformation. Do not try to learn from YouTube unless you're going to Khan Academy or a New York Times video or something equivalent, a Guardian video. That's not what it's designed for. I would tell you that journalism is to the attention economy what journalism would be to Pornhub. It's the wrong setting. The attention economy undervalues fact. It undervalues truth and expertise. And so the most important thing for us to do is to recognize that expertise really matters. And if you want to see the consequences of not having expertise, look at our response to COVID. Look at our response to the economic decline we're having right now. We are literally operating with the worst possible responses to both of those things. And we're going to pay a price for that that's going to last a long time. And internet platforms are almost entirely responsible for our inability to deal with that. And so, number one issue, do not get your political information from social media. Just don't. You want to have a fight, an argument? God bless. But do not try to learn anything from it. Most of what's going on is disinformation, and an awful lot of it's designed to cause you to lose interest in democracy and to not vote. I mean, this is the year where everyone has to vote. Pick what you're going to vote for. That's your choice. But everybody should vote. If we do less than 70% turnout this time, we don't deserve to have a representative democracy. And that's my core message to people. Social media and democracy are incompatible. And that we have to decide as a culture what values we care about. Is the almighty buck going to run absolutely everything? Or are we going to return to a model like the one we had into the 70s, where a CEO's job wasn't just to maximize shareholder value, but was also to balance the interests of employees, the communities where employees live, customers and suppliers, and to find a way to serve the interests of all of those constituencies. Because until we learn how to do that, we're going to continue to have income inequality that essentially requires over-policing in order to keep the masses down, right? Because that's what happens when you know, authoritarians like monopolies because they're easy to manage. Monopolies like intense policing because it keeps the population under control. It's no coincidence all these things are where they are. And right now we've begun the process of changing that. We should see it through. We should recognize this is a great opportunity. And, you know, that we've just, you know, I'm so proud of the people in these demonstrations for wearing masks and for being peaceful and not backing down. It's a beautiful thing.
Well, Roger, I'm very grateful to you for your expertise and for your commitment and for all that you're doing and are going to continue to do.
Scott, I really want to thank you for letting me be part of the Sun Valley Writers Conference. I mean, I look at the list of speakers and it's like, I mean, I'm a heavy reader and all these people that I revere, and I think to myself, what am I doing here? But it's such an honor and such a privilege. And to all the folks at the Sun Valley Writers Conference, thank you for the opportunity. And for all of those who are listening to this, just remember that this is our moment, that Future's going to look back on this time and say, this is when history was made. And all of us have a role to play in that, and I hope we play.